Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This highly practical podcast series explores HR and management hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Brought to you by Actus software, our aim is to build a better workplace for people. The HR Uprising is about collaborating and supporting each other to build the confidence and skills to rise up to each challenge and deliver real, lasting business value. You can find out more at hruprising.com or join our LinkedIn community. Now introducing your host, chartered psychologist, best-selling author, entrepreneur and speaker, Lucinda Carney.
Hi there, it's Lucinda introducing this week's podcast episode. Before we go into the detail of it, we've got a great one this week with Aoife O'Brien, who's a fellow podcaster, and we talk all about her research into belonging at work, which ties very much into engagement and talent management. Now, before I go on to that, I thought as this is our lockdown or emerging from lockdown episode on the 29th of March, how exciting is that? I would just mention a few other things that to make you aware of. First of all, I'm going to take a break next Monday, so there will be no episode released on Easter Monday. Our next episode after that will be with the fantastic Mervyn Dinnan the week after, all about internal mobility and talent management strategies. The other thing to let you know is that we've still, at time of recording, got 2 places left on our Change Superhero course. And that kicks off on the 14th of April. And also we've got a fantastic deal going on with our virtual manager program. If you've got somebody that you'd like to nominate to go on our virtual manager program, which also kicks off later in April, you get a free 3 months access to Actus Academy. And Actus Academy is already chocker with some great management resources, but we've now got employee resources on there in terms of e-learning and video resources. And we will be releasing 2 new modules all around change. So worth checking out Actus Academy, actually, if you were interested in it previously. So just a quick shout out to say you've got until Thursday to take advantage of this offer in terms of booking on those training. So if you want to know more, as ever, either just go to hruprising.com and all the links are there, or you can go directly to our actus.co.uk website and you'll be able to access them there as well. Okay, on to this week's episode. I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. As ever, my name is Lucinda Carney, and this week on the HR Uprising podcast, I have got a guest, and this is a first for me, a guest that I came across through Clubhouse. So welcome to Aoife O'Brien. Aoife, I'll allow you to explain yourself, introduce yourself a little bit more, explain yourself in a moment. But Aoife is also a podcast host, that she's a host of the Happier at Work podcast over in Ireland. She's a happiness and work expert and coach, but not in a fluffy way, in an academic way. And that's one of the things we're going to look at. In relation to this topic, we thought there's so many things we could talk about, aren't there? But we wanted to talk about talent fit or culture fit, the importance of fit within an organisation. And obviously, I know you've done some research in this area, Aoife, to look at, and how that might be the same or different in this new remote working environment. So welcome to the HR Uprising podcast, Aoife.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, Lucinda, and I'm a huge fan of the podcast. So I'm a bit fangirling at the moment now. So it's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So tell us a bit about yourself and your background and maybe how you got into this area of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have worked in the market research industry for about 17 years or so between Dublin, London. I worked in Perth as well for a time and Sydney before returning back to Dublin. And I worked in London for 3.5 years and I absolutely loved my job. And I think I probably took it for granted a little bit that I enjoyed it so much. And I just thought work, it should be brilliant, and work, everyone's always happy at work, and people who I worked with really enjoyed the roles as well. And subsequent to that, I had some experiences at work which just didn't quite feel right to me. So there was instances where, for example, I was told I was going to be promoted. I was doing a really, really great job. And one of my managers pulled me into a room not one of my managers, one of my colleagues pulled me into a room and said, started talking about some of the accounts that I was managing and what we might do with them. And I was really surprised by this. And I thought, what's going on here? And he said, oh, I'm your new boss. And I thought, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that at all. So obviously that was quite disappointing. There was no communication whatsoever. I felt very on the back foot, I suppose, in that situation. I felt very disappointed. My confidence was completely knocked. And not just in that instance, but for years later as well, I still felt that kind of the impact of that confidence. And it sort of planted the seed of, as an organization, I left that organization in less than a year and a half after I started. So as an individual, how can I make a better decision for myself and my career? How could I have avoided going into that situation? As an organization, they would have sponsored me to work there. They paid me quite a big salary as well. And as an organization, I left in less than a year and a half, and they could have prevented that. So looking at it from both sides, like, how can you prevent things like that happening? How can you avoid those types of situations? So fast forward a few years, and I was working back in Dublin, and a similar experience, although it was kind of, I loved my job for about 8 months, and then I didn't like it anymore, and then I hated it, and it was sort of up and down for around 4.5 years in total. And I got to a stage where I was like, this really isn't working out for me, and I have to do something about it. So when I started my master's, I was keen to talk to some of the lecturers about, what does all this mean? Why does this keep happening to me? And one of the lecturers mentioned that it's this concept of fit and fitting in at work. So as soon as I heard about that, I started doing all the research that I could around this concept. And so when I went to do my dissertation, that was the obvious choice for me. And, ask anyone who was in my class in college, and it was like, oh, Aoife loves talking about this concept of fit. And what I mean by fit, and, some people call it different things, and I'm very aware of that. To me, it's an issue of semantics. To me, this concept of person-environment fit that I ended up looking in, it incorporates various different types of fit. So like it could be person supervisor, it could be the person and the leader. And so it's various different types, but it encompasses these 3 particular concepts around values, needs, and abilities. So they were the 3 kind of core areas that I looked at. And I looked at the impact that this concept of fit has on work outcomes, but how those impacts are explained by need satisfaction. Because when I did my research, this concept of need satisfaction and ensuring that employees' needs are being satisfied at work became one of the really, really crucial elements, which was different to anything I'd ever understood about work. And it's very different to what you imagine and what you see at work, where it's like, oh, someone's being promoted. Well, what skills do they have? What number of years of experience do they have? When you see job ads out there, it is always about like, oh, must have MBA, must have 6 years of experience, or whatever it might be. It's always, always, always based on this concept that we need to have a certain level of ability in order to be able to carry out the job very well. So,
okay, so that's I get, so as a traditional, we've obviously got an HR audience here, so quite often we would be recruiting for ability and skills and experiences, wouldn't we? If I just go back to your 2 personal experiences that brought this to life, so your first one over in the UK where you left in 18 months, of course, which is high cost, isn't it, to an organisation if that happens, a real waste. You've gone through that just that point where you could start performing. So certain needs were not being met for you at that point. What would you say they were then?
That's a really great question. I think for me, it was the need for, probably the need for respect, the need for having a good manager, a good leadership team, the need for recognition as well for my contribution. So that certainly wasn't being met when I was at work. It was in Sydney. It wasn't in the UK. The UK was where I loved my job, absolutely loved it.
So what needs were being met there then?
The real sense of, I think, family and belonging. So this idea of feeling like you found kind of home, that you really get along. I was surrounded as well by really, really smart people. Like the people who I worked with were incredibly intelligent, but everyone was so welcoming, and there was always something going on, very social. I was new to the city, so it was a really, really great way for me to meet people as well. The work was challenging, so I really liked that aspect. So a few different needs definitely being met there.
It's really interesting you said that thing about respect, because the penny just dropped for me actually. So I know why I finally left the business that I was in for 10 years, and I left in 2008. And I'd been happy enough there. And then I got, after X amount of time, most of my time there, a different manager. And this manager that took over, I didn't think really respected what we'd achieved, and came in and felt like messing around with minimum experience. And the thing that I felt was missing was realised that I valued freedom. I didn't realise that I valued freedom as highly because I'd already had it. I'd always been able to just get on with stuff, and that was like, and then all of a sudden I felt like this person was messing with stuff and meddling with stuff, and I didn't have the freedom and autonomy that I'd had previously, and that was kind of what made me decide to leave. But I suppose the question I'd reflect back to you, because I know you said that there's these three aspects, which is abilities, needs, and values.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if I can tell the difference between needs and values in this context.
Okay,
Are they different?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So maybe some of the things that I explained, so maybe rather than respect being a need, it's more of a value that I have. And I feel like I would show respect to people, and I would feel that they should respect me as well. So let me explain a little bit more about what it means. So the values really are, they don't tend to change over time. So our values are core to ourselves, and they are part of our identity. So a value of mine, for example, would be order and structure. And how we can figure out what our values are as well is to have a think about decisions that you've made in the past and why you've made those decisions. So freedom, for example, is something that you've mentioned there. So that could be something that you really value. And if you look at decisions that you've made in the past, do they tie in with that value of freedom? And decisions that you feel good about and decisions that you feel bad about. Another way that you can ascertain what your values are is by looking at what really annoys you. So what bothers you a lot? And so for me, if someone leaves a mess, it really bothers me. If I leave a mess, it's okay. But if someone else leaves a mess, or if things are not in an ordered and structured way, I get really frustrated. So if I think about a filing system, for example, and if things aren't really set up in such a way that it's easy to find things, then that really frustrates me. So order and structure is a value of mine. Family is a really, really strong value. I was gone from Ireland for over 7 years, and one of the big reasons that I returned home was to spend more time with family. My brother was at a stage where he was going to be getting married, and I wanted to get to know my sister-in-law a lot better. And I wanted to be closer to my parents as they got older as well. So thinking about
it's interesting you use that though, because you use the sense of belonging to a family as the need that was being satisfied in the workplace. So it feels like they are an extension of your values in the workplace, the needs. That's what it feels like, the conversation we're having. But
I probably got them confused actually when I was talking more about what being satisfied. I'll explain a bit more about the needs in particular. So the needs is it's what drives us and what motivates us really. So that is, we are driven by satisfying needs. So if we all have these three basic psychological needs for autonomy, relatedness, and competence, and I'll talk about each of those individually in a minute. Right. They are universal and they are basic psychological needs that we all have. In addition to that, we all have unique needs as well. So, and again, I will expand on that in a second. Coming back to our shared needs, or the needs that everyone has. So they are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. Autonomy, and this is something that you mentioned a second ago, Lucinda. Yeah. This idea. So you could value freedom as one of your values, but you have a basic psychological need for autonomy. So
maybe that was what I was talking about then. Maybe that was what was being, I've interpreted it as a freedom value, but maybe it's the autonomy that was being the issue.
Thwarted. So it was being kind of pushed down in some way, and that need wasn't being met. So the need for autonomy is our ability to choose what we do and how we do it. And the interesting thing with these three needs is that they can be over or undersupplied. So if you imagine the need for autonomy being undersupplied is when you're being micromanaged. And I know certainly, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening today who can relate to that, of this experience of
that's one of the most common things that people complain about on a management, because their pet hate of a management course. But it is interesting where we go with this in terms of remote working, isn't it? Because
absolutely,
there's definitely been changes there.
Absolutely. And equally, the need for autonomy can be oversupplied as well. So that's kind of when the manager sort of takes their hands off a little bit, doesn't provide enough guidance for the person, and they're kind of left to their own devices, trying to figure out what direction they're going in and how they're going to get there. So each person will have a different level of what exactly they need. And it's about keeping those lines of communication open around those different areas. The need then for relatedness it goes back to this sense of belonging and how we relate to other people. And so that formed, another part of the research that I did. What wasn't included, which I think is really important as well, is how we relate what we do on a day-to-day basis to the overall, what the company is trying to achieve, and therefore the impact that we can have on essentially on the end clients, whether we're delivering directly to those clients or not. So understanding what that means, but also how what we do on a day-to-day basis, or what we do in our careers, how that's related to our life in general. And I think this year in particular has given so much opportunity for people to think, is this really what I want for my life? Do I want something more from my career? Does success mean something different than I thought it meant? Do I want something, do I want to live beside the sea? Do I want to have more free time? Do I want to spend more time with family? What is it that I need, and what role is work playing in that bigger picture for me? And then the third element is this area of competence. And that's this feeling of being capable of doing your job. And if you have not enough competence, maybe you feel like you're a bit of an imposter. And again, that's something that I often speak about. And if you have too much, you could be feeling a little bit bored, a little bit complacent as well. So it's about finding that right balance around that. And so
it's really interesting that I'm just thinking, so we've had somebody who joined a business and left quite quickly, which was really disappointing, but they kind of they went into a role that they hadn't applied for. And actually, I think the reason I look at it is because they just didn't feel they could do it. We tried to support them, and also in a remote environment, it was really quite tricky. But then I've also seen other things where you get this kind of, in terms of this whole cost of onboarding, how you bring people on effectively in an organization, particularly in a remote environment. How can we make sure that we give them the right amount of autonomy, even if they naturally, they need to have enough autonomy to get on with things, but not feel completely isolated? How do we allow them to feel like they're part of a team when they've never met anybody face to face? And how do we allow them to feel capable and competent when they don't want to ask at every turn what to do? I just think the onboarding piece with those three aspects, and of course knowing how important it is to get people there, your first experience, your first 2 weeks, 6 weeks, as to how long you stay with the business. For us to think about meeting those needs is quite important.
And before I dive in and answer that question, I wanted to just flag that another really interesting thing that came out of the research that I wasn't expecting was that we really need to make sure that we're satisfying these needs for at least 3 years from when we often talk about the onboarding process is for 6 months typically, and by a year someone is definitely going to be up to speed. But actually it's really important to keep that going, that momentum going for 3 years. Right. There's a significant drop off after 3 years when people are more likely then to stay in an organization, probably out of loyalty and commitment to that organization rather than from their needs being satisfied. In particular, in relation to remote working, for me, it's about keeping the lines of communication open, and it's about discussing, let's try something. And if this is working, then that's brilliant. So let's have a conversation once a week. And you can let me know, do you need more support from me as your manager? Do you need me to step back a little bit and give you a bit more freedom? I think when someone is new to an organization, it's more important to keep that kind of a bit more being aware of who you can reach out to. So who is the person? Because when you're in the office, I think you get a tour and you're like, okay, so that's who I go to for IT. And I just walk down and I ask the question, and that's where the HR office is. When you're remote, I think maybe having an image of who it is, or having all of those meetings set up in advance so you know who you need to speak to. You're very clear about what you need to speak to them about and what they can help you with. I think providing people with buddies or a mentor when they first start in an organization, so someone who's not in their team, but they can reach out to and be like, listen, I'm having a bit of an issue in relation to this. Can you talk me through it, or can you help me with that situation? So I think that is really, really important. The sense of belonging then, that's through team meetings, that's through informal coffee chats. People are probably zoomed out at the moment, but
finding things in common, isn't it, as well? So do we have a football chat or whatever that might be? Yeah.
And well, I interviewed a guest for my own podcast recently, and I absolutely loved his idea. He's building this amazing company, a digital marketing company, and what he does, he's building a totally people first culture. He's injecting joy and generosity into the organization. It's an amazing, amazing place. And one of the things that they do to get to know each other a bit better is random question of the day, just something simple like that.
I like it.
Yeah. I just thought, what a brilliant idea. And it's informal. They do it through Slack, I think. So someone might post a random question of the day, and then they'll different people will answer what that random question is. Now, I didn't ask them what kind of questions they ask, but I'm sure people can come up with their own random questions of the day and that they want, and it's a way to get to know people that is not work related. And it's, his big thing was helping people to take responsibility and to have a sense of agency, that they are in control over how they approach work. And they brought in or reinstigated the book club that they had previously. So they read regularly and they catch up on that. So it's all this non-work related stuff to help form and build relationships with the people at work. And I think that's really, really important. And
I like it.
And then onto the competence piece, really what is needed. And I've made this mistake as a manager myself, where people who I managed came to me and I thought, wow, they're doing a phenomenal job. They must know it. And you assume if someone's doing a really good job that they know they're doing a really good job. And this happened on 2 occasions, 2 separate people. And they approached me and they said, listen, can you let me know how I'm doing? They didn't say, oh, I really want to impress you, but it was obvious that I, as their manager, they saw me as like, this is someone who I really want to please. And I realized on 2 separate occasions, so obviously I didn't learn from the first time, that they weren't getting that from me. So I think as a manager, it's really, really important to tell your staff when they're doing something really well. But more than that, it's important to tell them specifically, like very specifically, this is what I would like to see more of, and to focus on that. And I mean, we could go off on a tangent and talk about feedback and the downfalls of giving constructive or negative feedback, but and keeping the focus on the positive side of things. But I think it's really, really important to deliver that feedback.
So it is our ability to, so that would be maybe them feeling that they were competent, or they're catching people doing things right, as opposed they might feel it's getting something critical, helping them to build that sense of competence.
Exactly.
And different people have different levels of natural confidence.
Yes.
Don't they, in terms of how much feedback they need to feel that they are there.
This is it.
Yeah. It's recognizing what the underlying need is behind that behavior, is what you're saying. So those are your 3 go on, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, well, that's exactly it. So they're the 3 universal needs, and everyone has those. And it's about having an open discussion about needs. And if you had asked me a few years ago, what are your values? What are your needs? I'd be like, Lucinda, I have no idea. I have no idea what they are. But if you can have that conversation, and it doesn't have to be as explicit as what are your needs, it can be listening out for specific cues about what frustrates people at work, or what's getting in the way of someone getting things done. Or what they're really enjoying about the role. So yeah, moving on to then the unique needs that people have. So they might have a unique need for recognition, for example. They might have a unique need for status and power, or variety, or stability. There's lots and lots of different needs, and it's making sure that they are satisfied as well, and knowing which levers then that you can pull in order to satisfy those needs.
So it feels a bit like that's quite Maslow-ish in the fact that you've got to get your universal ones working, but then you might be able to then take, if you give them enough variety or recognition, then people go higher up. And I'm sure this is how we started talking about this, didn't we, at Clubhouse, was about engagement. You can see how these feed into employee engagement, can't you?
Absolutely, yeah. Now, I want to just call out that if anyone, when I was at college, they were very adamant, like, if you write anything about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in any of your assignments, then, you know, it's going to get thrown out. God,
do you want to correct me? Do you want to put that in context so you don't get misquoted there? Then?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's something that everyone is so familiar with, but it's, you know, for academic research, it's not backed by science. So the specific theory that I looked at is called self-determination theory. It's not based on a hierarchy. It doesn't mean that you have to satisfy autonomy first, and then once that's satisfied, you can go to the next level or anything like that. All needs need to be satisfied. If one is not being satisfied, then it has an impact on engagement. It has an impact on job satisfaction. So it's about.
Would you say that universal, in this context, in this thing, would you say that the universal needs and the unique needs are equally important then?
Oh, that's really interesting. And maybe that's something I can do research on in the future. I didn't include the unique needs as part of my research, just in terms of time and space. And I think the model that I was using was pretty complicated as it was. I wanted to include everything in it. But that could be something that I look at in the future for sure. And that's where I was coming from in the Maslow shortcut. I suppose I was just feeling like maybe the universal ones have to be met first, and if they're not, then going on to the universe. But I've nothing to substantiate that. Just for the benefit of the listener, you talked about self-determination. Do you want to just briefly explain that? So otherwise people might go, what is that? Self-determination theory, absolutely. DC and Ryan came up with that, I think, in around the early 90s, and it's exactly as I explained, the concept of autonomy, relatedness, and competence, and it's one of the core theories of motivation and what drives us at work, essentially. So when those needs for autonomy, relatedness, and competence are being satisfied, then we feel motivated and we feel satisfied at work. But as I did more research, or, you know, things that have been built on that, and there hasn't been a huge amount done, is this idea of not just satisfying the need, but finding that it's not being over or under supplied. And again, I didn't include that as part of my research, but I would love to understand more about that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you can go on, and that's where, as I say, going into the engagement thing, which I know there are ups and downs in terms of how well evidenced this is. You're saying you didn't go to engagement because it's massive topic, and again there's some questions, but I just recently recorded a podcast on that, which is part of your input was contributing to that. That's in that engagement podcast I looked at, one of the engagement elements they talked about is autonomy. They were using autonomy. If you have autonomy, then that will be an engagement driver. I actually question whether that is the case when you are thrust into autonomy. I think, you know, going back to our point about is maybe we'll have our levels of autonomy. For some of us, it might be that we want to be 100% autonomous. But actually, if you'd rather not be 100% autonomous, then you can have too much of a good thing. Well, that concept.
This is exactly it. And if you imagine yourself at the start of your career, you needed much less autonomy than what you need as your career progresses. As you become and gain more confidence, you become more confident in yourself, you're more sure of what needs to be done. But, you know, it is about finding that balance. And therefore, that's when this idea of keeping the communication lines open becomes really crucially important. You know, being able to have those difficult conversations as a manager, as an employee. How do you have those conversations to say, listen, I need a little bit more guidance from you as my manager, or I need you to back off a little bit and let me just get on with the role. I know what I'm doing. And when you step in and try and take over, it makes me feel like I am incompetent and I don't really know what I'm doing, when in fact I do.
So we definitely should stand up for ourselves in terms of that. I guess in And sorry, this does definitely link into job satisfaction and retention, and these are useful things to be aware of. If what would you say to HR professionals who are listening as to what they could do to increase fit in their organisation? It's going to help you retain people. It's going to help people well-being wise. I'm sure there would be logically a map over there as well. What sort of closing thoughts have you got?
Absolutely. So for me, the crucial thing is to hire for values. And I hear a lot of people talking about this: hire for culture fit, hire for attitude, things like that. So hire for values. So first step, understand what are your core values as an organization. If you don't know them, do some work around that. That's definitely something that I could help with. So find out what your core values are. Are those values, if you know what they are they being lived in the organization? Is that how behavior is reflected? Is that how decisions are made? Are they in line with your values? And so that would be the first step. And then once you get people in the door, then it's about dialing up the need satisfaction. So how can I keep these people in the organization by making sure that their needs are being satisfied? Everyone has the 3 universal needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And everyone will have additional unique needs that are needed or that are required to be satisfied and not thwarted at work. And, I recognize the importance of people's abilities, but it did come out as the least important factor for driving this sense of fit at work. And I do kind of want to acknowledge that it's important, I think, and I've had this experience myself, of making sure that we are working to our strengths. And, if someone is interested in the area that they are working in, if someone is really skilled at the areas that they're working in, I think it does definitely drive a sense of satisfaction, but it's not the greatest area. And one of the really interesting kind of one-liners, if you like, that came out of the research was this idea of being able to, it's higher for values, but think about what can be learned versus what can't. You can't teach someone to have new values, but you can teach someone how things are done around here, or you can give them new skills around your software. So think about what can be learned versus what can't.
So again, that whole thing about hire for aptitude. And I can see that maybe the abilities would feed into that need value of competence. If you don't feel you've got the need, then you're not going to feel so competent.
Absolutely.
So you've got to link those up there. So you don't want fundamentally somebody who can't do it. So, we could talk for ages, couldn't we, Aoife? So thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast. I'm going to let you introduce, obviously, as I mentioned at the start, guys, that Aoife has her own podcast. I'm going to let you tell us how people can find you if they'd like to work with you or know more about what you do.
Absolutely. Yeah. The best way to find me is to go over to my website, happieratwork.ie. That's the domain for Ireland. You'll find the Happier at Work podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also listen directly on the website as well. And I'm always open to connecting with people on LinkedIn. So if you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm sure there'll be a link in the show notes, but also I'll spell out my name for people because it's going to be a difficult one, I think. And my name is...
You need to know Irish people to know how to spell that, don't you?
Exactly. So it's spelled Aoife and it's pronounced Aoife. So Aoife O'Brien.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on our podcast, and it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Lucinda.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising, proudly brought to you by Actus Software, the joined-up performance and talent management solution. You can access links to any of the information or resources mentioned in the show via the podcast page at www.hruprising.com. If you like what we do, please subscribe, tell your colleagues, and leave a review. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising.